You know that moment when everything you thought you knew about your life crumbles in an instant? When the people you've given everything to show you exactly how little you mean to them? I'm Kimberly Torres, and I'm about to tell you about the Mother's Day that changed everything. The day my family left me sitting alone at a restaurant table, abandoned like yesterday's newspaper. But here's the thing they didn't know. I wasn't just any forgotten mother. I was the woman who held all the cards, and I was about to play my hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of my bedroom window, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floor I'd polished just yesterday. At 62, I still woke before dawn, a habit formed through decades of preparing breakfast for a family that rarely acknowledged the effort. Today was different, though. Today was Mother's Day, and for the first time in years, I felt a flutter of genuine excitement in my chest. I stood before my walk-in closet, fingers trailing over the fabric of dresses that had hung unworn for months. Most of my wardrobe consisted of practical clothes, comfortable shoes for long days, cardigans that hid the weight I'd gained through years of stress eating, simple blouses that wouldn't show stains from cooking and cleaning. But today, I pulled out the navy blue dress with tiny pearl buttons that I'd bought on sale 6 months ago and never had occasion to wear. The mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized anymore. My dark hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled, back in the same simple bun I'd worn for the past decade. Lines mapped the journey of my life across my face, some from laughter, but too many from worry and disappointment. My brown eyes, once bright with dreams and ambition, had dulled to a practical hazel that matched my everyday existence. But today, I applied lipstick. Real lipstick. Not just the chapstick I usually grabbed on my way out the door. I chose earrings, the small gold hoops my mother had given me before she passed, ones I'd stored away because they seemed too fancy for grocery runs and doctor's appointments. I even sprayed a light mist of the perfume that had sat untouched on my dresser for 2 years. The house around me held the silence of a Sunday morning, but it was different from the oppressive quiet I'd grown accustomed to. Today, the silence felt anticipatory, like the moment before a surprise party. My family had been secretive all week, whispering conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, exchanging glances that suggested something wonderful was brewing. "Mom's going to love it," I'd overheard my daughter Sophia say to her brother, Miguel, on Thursday evening. They'd been huddled in the kitchen, voices low but excited. When I'd appeared in the doorway with a basket of clean laundry, they'd sprung apart like guilty teenagers. "Love what?" I'd asked, setting the basket on the counter between them. "Nothing, Mom," Sophia had replied too quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Hink. Just planning something special for Sunday." Miguel had nodded enthusiastically, his dark eyes, so much like his father's, twinkling with mischief. "You're going to have the best Mother's Day ever, Ma. Trust us." Those words had sustained me through the week as I went about my usual routines. Grocery shopping with a list carefully organized by aisle, something I'd perfected over the years to maximize efficiency. Meal planning that considered everyone's preferences, Roberto's distaste for spicy food, Sophia's current vegetarian phase, Miguel's girlfriend Carmen's gluten sensitivity, and little Isabella's pickiness that seemed to change daily. The laundry alone was a full-time job. Roberto's work clothes that came home stained with grease and sweat from his construction job. Sophia's business attire that required careful attention to maintain the professional image she'd worked so hard to build as a real estate agent. Miguel's restaurant uniforms that smelled of kitchen oils and required immediate washing. Carmen's delicate fabrics that needed gentle cycles and air drying. And Isabella's school clothes that somehow accumulated more stains in one day than seemed physically possible. I'd been doing this dance for 35 years, ever since Sophia was born, when I was 27. Back then, I'd had plans of my own. I'd been 2 years into a business degree, working part-time at a small accounting firm downtown, dreaming of opening my own practice someday. But pregnancy changed everything, as it does for so many women. Roberto was working construction then. 2, making barely enough to support himself, let alone a family. "We'll figure it out, mi amor," he'd said when I told him about the pregnancy, his hands gentle on my face. "You can always go back to school later." Later. That word had haunted me for decades. Later, when the baby is older. Later, when we have more money. Later, when Roberto's business takes off. Later, when the kids are in school. Later, when they're out of school. Later, when we're more settled. Later had become never, one postponement at a time. But I'd made peace with it, or so I told myself. I'd found fulfillment in building something different. A family, a home, a legacy of love and sacrifice that would outlast any business degree. I'd watched Sophia grow from a colicky baby into a determined little girl who announced at age 8 that she was going to sell houses when she grew up. I'd celebrated when Miguel discovered his passion for cooking, spending hours in our kitchen experimenting with recipes while I pretended not to notice the flour coating every surface. I'd been there for every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every triumph. When Sophia had her first period and was too embarrassed to tell Roberto, I'd taken her shopping for supplies and explained what it meant to become a woman. When Miguel had struggled with math in high school, I'd stayed up late night after night, working through problems with him until concepts clicked. When they'd both left for college, I'd cried for days, then channeled that empty nest energy into making Roberto's life easier. Roberto and I had been married for 37 years, together since I was 24 and he was 26. He'd been the handsome charmer who could make me laugh until my sides hurt, who'd promised me adventures and romance. In the early years, we'd taken weekend drives to nowhere in particular, sharing dreams and planning our future. He'd supported my decision to stay home with the children, praising my mothering skills and telling me I was building something more important than any career. Somewhere along the way, though, those weekend drives had stopped. The dreams we'd shared had shifted into practical discussions about mortgages and car repairs, and which child needed new shoes. Romance had been replaced by routine, passion by practicality. We'd become roommates who shared expenses and responsibilities, but rarely shared thoughts or feelings anymore. Still, I'd convinced myself that this was normal, that this was what long marriages looked like. Other women my age complained about similar things. Husbands who came home exhausted and wanted dinner ready. Children who called only when they needed something. Grandchildren who were too busy with their own lives to visit often. But today felt different. Today, my family was planning something special just for me. I made my way downstairs to the kitchen, the heart of our home. The room hadn't been updated in 15 years, but I'd kept it spotless and functional. White. Cabinets that I'd painted myself when we couldn't afford to replace them. Countertops I'd learned to work around despite the crack near the sink that had been there for a decade. The refrigerator covered with photos spanning decades. School. Pictures, graduation photos, vacation snapshots from the rare trips we'd taken. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet house with the rich aroma that had marked the beginning of every day for as long as I could remember. I'd bought the same brand of coffee for 20 years, a medium roast that pleased everyone's taste. Not too strong for the kids, not too weak for Roberto, perfectly adequate for me. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I allowed myself to imagine what the day might bring. Maybe they'd planned a brunch at that new restaurant downtown that Sophia had mentioned wanting to try. Perhaps Miguel was cooking something special, utilizing the skills he'd honed during his culinary arts program. Maybe they'd all gathered to give me something I'd mentioned wanting, new curtains for the living room or the garden tools I'd been eyeing at the hardware store. More than any gift, though, I wanted their attention. I wanted them to see me, really see me, the way they had when they were children, and I was the center of their universe. I wanted them to acknowledge what I'd given up, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd built for them with my own hands and heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted my reverie. Roberto appeared in the kitchen, his graying hair still messy from sleep, wearing the same ratty t-shirt he'd worn to bed for the past 5 years. At 59, he was still a handsome man, though his body showed the wear of decades in construction. His shoulders, once broad and strong, now curved slightly forward. His hands, scarred from countless minor injuries, moved more slowly than they once had. "Morning," he mumbled, heading straight for the coffee pot without looking at me. "Good morning," I replied, hoping for some acknowledgement of the day's significance, some hint of the surprise that was supposedly coming. He poured his coffee, added the 2 sugars he'd used every morning for 37 years, and took a long sip. Only then did he seem to notice that I was dressed differently. "You're up early," he observed, not mentioning my appearance. "It's Mother's Day," I said, unable to keep a note of expectation from my voice. "Right," he nodded, but his expression remained neutral. "Sophia said something about lunch later." Before I could respond, we heard the front door open and voices in the hallway. Sophia's laugh carried into the kitchen, followed by Miguel's deeper chuckle and the higher pitch of his girlfriend Carmen's voice. Little Isabella's feet pounded across the hardwood floor as she ran toward the kitchen. "Abuela!" she called out, bursting through the doorway with the boundless energy of a 7-year-old. She threw herself into my arms, and for a moment, the world felt exactly as it should. Isabella was Sophia's daughter, the result of a relationship that had ended badly when she was just a baby. Sophia had moved back home during that difficult time, and I'd helped raise Isabella while Sophia worked to establish her real estate career. Now that Sophia was doing well financially, they lived in their own apartment across town, but Isabella still spent weekends with us. "You look pretty, Abuela," Isabella said, touching the pearl buttons on my dress. "Are we going somewhere special?" "I think so, mija," I replied, smoothing her dark curls. "Your mama has been planning something." Sophia entered the kitchen then, looking polished and put together as always. At 35, she'd inherited my bone structure but Roberto's confident bearing. Her dark hair was professionally styled, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. She wore a coral-colored dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. "Morning, Mom," she said, kissing my cheek absently while checking her phone. "You ready for today?" "I've been ready all week," I laughed, trying to match her energy. "What exactly am I getting ready for?" "You'll see," she said mysteriously, then turned to Roberto. "Dad, you need to be ready to leave at 11:30. Miguel appeared next, tall and lean like his father, but with softer features that reminded me of my own father. At 32, he'd found his calling in the restaurant industry, working. His way up from prep cook to sous chef at one of the city's better establishments. Carmen followed close behind him, a petite blonde who'd been dating my son for almost 2 years. Carmen had always been polite to me, but there was a distance there that I'd never been able to bridge. She came from a different world than we did. Her parents were both doctors. She had an MBA. She spoke about travel and experiences that were foreign to my practical existence. I sometimes caught her looking around our house with barely concealed judgment, taking in the outdated furniture and modest decorations with the kind of assessment that made me self-conscious. "Something smells good," Miguel said, though I hadn't started cooking anything yet. The only scent in the air was coffee and the faint trace of my perfume. "Just coffee so far," I replied. "Should I make breakfast? I could do those pancakes Isabella likes, or maybe—" "No need, Mom," Sophia interrupted, still focused on her phone. "We'll eat at the restaurant." Restaurant. My heart gave a little flutter of excitement. It had been months since we'd all gone out to eat together, and years since it had been specifically for me. Where are we going? I asked, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. Casa Flores, Miguel announced with a grin. I made reservations for noon. Casa Flores was a family-owned Mexican restaurant that had been in our neighborhood for decades. It wasn't fancy, but the food was authentic and the portions generous. More importantly, it was the place Roberto had taken me for our first official date, back when we were young and everything seemed possible. Oh, I said, touched by the choice. That's perfect. I haven't been there in so long. Yeah, well, it was the only place that could fit us all on short notice, Sophia said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. I mean, it'll be nice to go back there. I chose to focus on the first part of her comment. They'd planned this. Recently, maybe even last minute, but they'd planned it. That's what mattered. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. I helped Isabella pick out an outfit from the small wardrobe she kept in what used to be Sophia's room. I made sure Roberto had clean clothes laid out, knowing that, left to his own devices, he'd emerge in work jeans and a faded polo shirt. I tidied the already clean house, a nervous habit that had developed over years of unexpected visits from Sophia's real estate clients or Miguel's restaurant friends. By 11:30, we were all assembled in the living room, looking like a proper family heading out for a celebration. Roberto wore khakis and a button-down shirt I'd ironed the night before. Sophia looked stunning in her coral dress and matching shoes. Miguel had dressed up in slacks and a nice sweater, while Carmen wore what I was certain was a designer outfit that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Isabella had chosen a pink sundress with flowers that made her look like a little princess. And me? I felt transformed in my navy dress with the pearl buttons, wearing earrings and lipstick, carrying a small purse instead of the oversized tote bag that usually accompanied me everywhere. For the first time in years, I felt like a woman with her own identity, instead of just someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's grandmother. Everyone ready? Sophia asked, jangling her car keys. We're taking your car? Roberto asked. Mine's bigger, Sophia replied. We'll all fit better. This made sense. Sophia drove a 7-passenger SUV, necessary for her real estate business, but also perfect for family outings. Roberto's pickup truck could only seat 3 people, and my 10-year-old sedan was reliable, but cramped. We piled into Sophia's vehicle, with Roberto in the front passenger seat, Miguel and Carmen in the middle row, and Isabella and me in the back. I was glad to sit with my granddaughter, who chattered excitedly about school and her friends and the book she was reading for a school project. Tell me about this book, I said, genuinely interested in her thoughts. It's about a girl who goes on adventures, Isabella explained, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. She's brave and smart, and she saves people. I want to be like her when I grow up. You can be anything you want to be, mija, I told her, smoothing her hair. Don't let anyone tell you different. That's what Mama says too, Isabella nodded. She says women can do anything men can do, maybe even better. I glanced toward the front of the car, where Sophia was navigating Sunday morning traffic with practiced ease. My daughter had certainly proven that point, building a successful career in a competitive field, raising a daughter largely on her own, creating the kind of independent life I'd never had the courage to pursue. Your mama is right, I said quietly. She's very smart. The drive to Casa Flores took about 20 minutes, winding through neighborhoods I'd known for decades. I watched familiar landmarks pass by. The elementary school both my children had attended, the park where I'd pushed them on swings and watched them learn to ride bikes, the grocery store where I'd shopped weekly for 35 years. This was my world, these few square miles that contained everything I'd ever known as an adult. I'd rarely traveled beyond this radius except for the occasional family vacation or visit to relatives in other parts of the state. While other women my age posted photos on Facebook from cruises and European tours, my adventures were limited to new restaurants in neighboring towns or day trips to local attractions. I'd told myself this was contentment, that I was blessed to have such deep roots in one community. But sitting in the back of my daughter's SUV, looking out at the same streets I'd driven for decades, I felt a sudden pang of something I couldn't quite name. Regret? Restlessness? A sense of opportunities missed? "There it is," Miguel said, pointing ahead to the familiar red and green sign of Casa Flores. The restaurant looked exactly as I remembered it, a converted house with a small parking lot painted in cheerful colors that had faded slightly over the years. Piñatas hung in the windows, and the sound of mariachi music drifted from the outdoor speakers. It was the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades, reliable and familiar. Sophia found a parking space near the front door, and we all climbed out of the SUV. The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and I felt a surge of happiness as we walked toward the entrance as a family. This was what I'd been missing, this sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than my daily routines. Inside, Casa Flores was exactly as I remembered. Dark wood tables, colorful tile work, the smell of cumin and cilantro that always made my mouth water. The hostess, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted us warmly. "Table for 6?" she asked. "Yes," Sophia replied. "We have a reservation under Torres." "Right this way," the hostess said, leading us through the dining room to a large table, near the back. The table was perfectly positioned, with a view of the small stage where mariachi bands performed on weekend evenings. It was round, which meant everyone could see everyone else, perfect for family conversation. I felt a surge of gratitude toward Miguel for choosing this place, and toward Sophia for organizing whatever surprise was coming. We settled into our seats, with Isabella insisting on sitting next to me and Roberto taking the chair across from mine. Sophia sat to my left, already pulling out her phone to check messages. Miguel and Carmen took the remaining seats, immediately launching into a quiet conversation about something work-related. "This is nice," I said to the table in general, hoping to start a family conversation. "It's been too long since we've all been here together." Sophia murmured, still focused on her phone. "Mom, do you remember when you brought us here for Miguel's birthday when he was little?" I tried again, looking toward Roberto. He ordered 3 different desserts and made himself sick. Roberto looked up from his menu with a vague smile. "That sounds like him." I waited for more, but he'd already returned his attention to the food options, even though I knew he'd order the same thing he always ordered: beef fajitas with extra guacamole. Our server appeared, a friendly, middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Maria. She took our drink orders efficiently, and I found myself appreciating her professionalism and warmth. This was how service should be, I thought. Attentive without being intrusive, friendly without being fake. "Are you celebrating anything special today?" Maria asked as she set down our drinks. "Mother's Day," Isabella announced proudly, smiling at me. "It's for my abuela." "How wonderful," Maria said, her face lighting up. "We have a special dessert for mothers today, tres leches cake with fresh strawberries. I'll make sure to save you a piece." "That sounds lovely, thank you," I replied, touched by the gesture. As Maria walked away, I felt a warm glow of appreciation for this simple acknowledgement. This stranger had shown more interest in celebrating my motherhood than my own family had so far. We ordered our meals, falling into the comfortable rhythm of a family who'd shared countless restaurant meals over the years. I chose the chicken mole, a dish I never made at home because the sauce was so time-consuming to prepare properly. Roberto ordered his usual fajitas. Sophia selected a salad that probably cost as much as the rest of our meals combined. Miguel chose the chef's special, always interested in trying new preparations. Carmen ordered carefully, asking detailed questions about ingredients and preparation methods that made me wonder if she was still following some restrictive diet. "So," I said, once our server had left, "what's the special surprise everyone's been hinting about all week?" Sophia and Miguel exchanged a glance that I couldn't interpret. "Well," Sophia began, then paused to check her phone again. We thought it would be nice to have lunch together. This is it? I asked, trying to keep disappointment from my voice. I mean, this is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I'm so happy. We're all here together. What more did you want? Roberto asked, and there was an edge to his voice that I recognized. It was the tone he used when he thought I was being demanding or ungrateful. Nothing, I said quickly. This is perfect. I just thought maybe, with all the secrecy this week. We're here, aren't we? Sophia said, finally putting her phone face down on the table. We took time out of our Sunday to have lunch with you. Took time out. The phrase stung more than it should have. As if spending time with me was an inconvenience, a chore to be checked off their weekend to-do lists. Of course, I replied, forcing a smile. I'm grateful. And I was grateful, I told myself. How many women my age had families who still made the effort to get together at all? How many mothers spent Mother's Day alone, wishing for exactly what I had right now? Our food arrived, beautifully presented and deliciously fragrant. The chicken mole was rich and complex, with just the right balance of sweet and spicy that made Casa Flores famous in our neighborhood. Isabella chattered about school and her friends while she worked her way through a plate of cheese quesadillas. Roberto ate methodically, as he did everything else, cutting his fajitas into precise bites and taking his time with each one. Sophia picked at her salad while continuing to glance at her phone. Sorry, she said when she noticed me watching. I have a client who's supposed to close on a house tomorrow, and there's some issue with the financing. On Sunday? I asked. Real estate doesn't follow normal business hours, Mom. You know that. I did know that. Sophia had explained many times how her success came from being available to clients whenever they needed her. She'd built her business on that kind of dedication, and I was proud of what she'd accomplished. But today was Mother's Day, and I'd hoped her clients could wait a few hours. Miguel and Carmen were deep in their own conversation, something about a new restaurant opening across town that was getting great reviews. They spoke in the shorthand of people who shared professional interests, using terms and references I didn't understand. This place has amazing presentation, Carmen was saying. Very Instagram-worthy. They're getting great social media buzz. The food has to back up the hype, though, Miguel replied. Pretty plates don't mean much if the flavors aren't there. I listened to their exchange, feeling like an observer rather than a participant in my own Mother's Day celebration. These were my children, the babies I'd carried and nursed and raised, but their lives had evolved beyond my understanding. They inhabited worlds I'd never entered. Sophia's realm of real estate deals and property investments, Miguel's universe of culinary trends and restaurant politics. When had this happened? When had I become the outsider looking in on their lives instead of being at the center of them? Abuela, are you okay? Isabella asked, touching my arm with small fingers that reminded me of her mother at the same age. I'm fine, mija, I said, realizing I'd been lost in thought. Just enjoying watching everyone. Do you want to try some of my quesadilla? She offered, holding up a triangle of melted cheese and perfectly browned tortilla. That's very sweet of you, I said, accepting the bite she offered. It was delicious, simple, and perfect in the way that only a child's favorite food could be. Isabella's gesture of sharing reminded me of countless meals when my own children were small, when they'd insist I taste everything on their plates, when they'd save the best bites for me because I was the most important person in their world. Now they barely noticed what I was eating, let alone offered to share their meals with me. Tell me about school, I said to Isabella, craving connection with someone at this table. What's your favorite subject this year? Reading, she replied immediately. I love stories about brave girls who go on adventures. My teacher says I'm reading at a high school level. That's wonderful, I told her, and meant it. Reading opens up the whole world. You can travel anywhere, meet anyone, learn anything. That's what Mama says too. Isabella nodded. She says education is the most important thing, that it gives you choices. Choices. Another word that cut deeper than it should have. Sophia had made sure she had choices, staying in school, building a career, maintaining her independence even as a single mother. I was proud of her for that, truly I was. But it also highlighted everything I'd given up, all the choices I'd surrendered in the name of family and duty. Your mama is very wise, I said, glancing toward Sophia, who was still absorbed in her phone. The conversation around the table continued in fragments. Work stress, weekend plans, casual observations about the food and service. I contributed when directly asked questions, but mostly I found myself observing my family as if seeing them clearly for the first time. Roberto had always been a man of few words, but when had he stopped making an effort to include me in conversations? When had we stopped sharing thoughts and dreams and daily observations? We lived in the same house, shared the same bed, but we'd become strangers who happened to have the same address. Sophia was successful and independent, everything I'd wanted her to become. But when had she started treating me like an obligation, rather than a person she genuinely wanted to spend time with? When had I become someone she checked on out of duty rather than love? Miguel was pursuing his passion, building skills and experiencing the kind of career satisfaction I'd never known. But when had he stopped seeing me as someone with opinions and interests worth considering? When had I become just mom, a role rather than a person? I should probably get going soon, Sophia said, checking her phone again. I want to swing by the office and take care of this client situation. On Mother's Day? I asked before I could stop myself. It'll just take a few minutes, she replied, not meeting my eyes. You understand, right? Business is business. I did understand, in the rational part of my mind. But in my heart, in the part of me that had looked forward to this day all week, I felt something crack. Of course, I said, because what else could I say? Miguel glanced at his watch. Yeah, I should head out too. We've got prep work for tomorrow's special menu. You both work too much, I said, trying to keep my tone light. When I was your age? Different times, Mom, Sophia interrupted gently but firmly. Competition is fiercer now. You have to stay ahead. Different times. As if my experiences, my struggles, my sacrifices were irrelevant because they'd happened in a different era. As if the years I'd spent building the foundation they stood on didn't count, because the world had changed around us. We finished our meals in increasingly fragmented conversation. Sophia handled several work calls, stepping away from the table twice to speak privately with clients. Miguel and Carmen discussed their evening plans, which apparently involved meeting friends at a trendy bar downtown. Roberto ate steadily and said little, occasionally nodding when someone addressed him directly. Only Isabella seemed truly present, asking me questions about my childhood, telling me stories about her friends at school, sharing observations about everything from the mariachi music playing softly in the background to the colorful tiles on the restaurant walls. Abuela, will you come to my school play next Friday? She asked as we waited for the server to bring our check. I'm playing a flower in the garden scene. I wouldn't miss it, I promised, meaning every word. What kind of flower are you? A sunflower, she said proudly. Because I'm tall and I have yellow in my costume. Sunflowers are my favorite, I told her. They always turn their faces toward the sun, looking for light. That's beautiful, Abuela. You should write that down. Write that down. As if my words were worth preserving, worth remembering. When had anyone else in my family suggested that my thoughts were worth recording? Maria returned with our check and the promised tres leches cake, beautifully presented with fresh strawberries and a small candle. For our special mother, she announced, setting the dessert in front of me with a flourish. The cake was perfect, moist and sweet, with just the right balance of cream and fruit. I shared it with Isabella, who declared it the best cake ever, while the adults at the table checked phones and made subtle motions toward leaving. Roberto paid the check, as he always did, counting out bills carefully and leaving what I knew was exactly 15% tip, no more, no less. It was the same percentage he'd left at every restaurant for 37 years, regardless of service quality or occasion. We gathered our things and made our way toward the exit, Isabella skipping ahead while holding my hand. I felt a surge of affection for this little girl who still saw magic in ordinary moments, who still believed that spending time with family was the most important thing you could do on a Sunday afternoon. Outside, the afternoon sun had grown warmer, and the parking lot was filling with families arriving for late lunches. I watched a group climb out of a minivan, parents about my children's age, 3 kids ranging from toddler to teenager, everyone, talking at once as they headed toward the restaurant entrance. They looked chaotic, but connected, genuinely happy to be together. "Thanks for lunch," I said as we reached Sophia's SUV. "This was really nice." "You're welcome, Mom," Sophia replied, but she was already pulling out her keys, eager to move on to her next obligation. We climbed back into the vehicle, the same seating arrangement as before. This time, though, the mood felt different. The adults seemed ready to return to their individual lives, the brief interlude of family time completed satisfactorily. "Drop me at my car first?" Miguel asked as Sophia started the engine. "Me too," Carmen added. "I need to get home and change before we meet everyone tonight." "What about Dad and me?" I asked. "I'll drop you next," Sophia said, backing out of the parking space while checking her mirrors. "Then I need to swing by the office." The drive back was quieter than the trip to the restaurant. Miguel and Carmen discussed their evening plans in low voices. Roberto stared out the window, possibly napping with his eyes open, something he'd perfected over the years. Isabella leaned against me, tired from the excitement of the day. Sophia's phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system, and she answered, without checking who was calling. "Sophia Torres," she said in her professional voice. "Sophia, thank God you answered," came a woman's voice through the speakers. "The lender is saying there's a problem with the appraisal, and my buyers are freaking out. Can you meet me at the property? I know it's Sunday, but—" "Of course," Sophia interrupted. "I can be there in 20 minutes. She ended the call and glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Sorry, Mom. This is a big deal. 6-figure commission if it goes through." "I understand," I said, and I did understand the practical necessity. But understanding didn't make the disappointment hurt less. We dropped Miguel and Carmen at the parking garage where they'd left their cars. Quick hugs, promises to call during the week, and they were gone, walking away holding hands and already discussing their evening plans. The drive to our house took another 10 minutes. Sophia pulled into our driveway but left the engine running. "Thanks again for lunch," I said, gathering my purse and helping Isabella with her seatbelt. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," Sophia said, leaning over to give me a quick kiss on the cheek. Then to Isabella. "Be good for Abuela and Abuelo. I'll pick you up after school tomorrow." "Bye, Mama," Isabella said, then turned to me. "Can we look at photo albums when we get inside? I want to see pictures of when you were little." "Of course, Misha," I replied, touched by her interest in my history. Roberto and I stood in the driveway, watching Sophia back out and drive away, probably already thinking about the client crisis waiting for her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across our front yard, highlighting the roses I'd planted along the walkway, the carefully maintained lawn that Roberto mowed every Saturday morning. "Well," Roberto said, fishing his keys from his pocket. "That was nice." Nice. Such a bland word for what was supposed to be a special celebration. But at least he'd acknowledged the day, which was more than I'd expected from him lately. Inside our house, the quiet felt different than it had that morning. The anticipatory silence had been replaced by something heavier, more permanent. Isabella ran upstairs to change into play clothes, leaving Roberto and me alone in the living room. I think I'll watch the game, Roberto announced, reaching for the remote control. What game? I asked. Baseball. Dodgers are playing. He settled into his recliner, the one that the television flickered to life, filling our living room with the familiar sounds of stadium crowds and commentator chatter. Roberto adjusted the volume with practiced ease, settling deeper into his worn leather recliner that had molded to his body over the past decade. The chair faced away from the couch where I usually sat, creating a physical barrier that seemed to mirror the emotional distance that had grown between us over the years. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching my husband of 37 years disappear into the game. His shoulders relaxed in a way they rarely did during conversation with me anymore. His face, lined with years of outdoor work and worry, softened as he focused on something that didn't require emotional investment or difficult discussions. I'm going to change clothes, I announced, though I wasn't sure he heard me over the play-by-play commentary. Upstairs, Isabella had transformed from the polite little girl at lunch into a whirlwind of energy. She'd changed into pink leggings and a t-shirt covered in glittery unicorns, her dark hair escaping from the careful ponytail Sophia had crafted that morning. She was pulling photo albums from the hallway closet, creating a pile on the floor that represented decades of carefully preserved memories. "Look, abuela," she called out, holding up a thick album with a burgundy cover. This one says Kim and Roberto 1988 on the front. My heart gave a small flutter at hearing my name spoken with such enthusiasm. When had anyone last shown genuine interest in my personal history, in the woman I'd been before I became defined entirely by my relationships to others? I kicked off my dress shoes, feeling immediate relief as my feet settled into the familiar comfort of the carpet. The navy dress with pearl buttons suddenly felt too formal for an ordinary Sunday afternoon, at home. In my bedroom, I hung it carefully in the closet, running my fingers over the fabric one last time before selecting a soft cotton blouse and comfortable slacks. The mirror reflected a different woman than the one who'd prepared so hopefully that morning. The lipstick had worn off during lunch, leaving my lips looking pale and undefined. The silver threads in my hair seemed more prominent now, catching the afternoon light streaming through the bedroom window. The lines around my eyes appeared deeper, etched by years of squinting into the sun while hanging laundry, worrying about bills, watching my children grow up and away from me. I removed the gold hoop earrings my mother had given me, placing them carefully in the small jewelry box that held the few precious pieces I owned. The perfume had faded to barely a whisper, leaving behind only the familiar sense of fabric softener and the lavender soap I'd used for years. Back in the hallway, Isabella had arranged the photo albums in chronological order, displaying an organizational skill that reminded me of her mother at the same age. She sat cross-legged on the carpet, already absorbed in the earliest album, which contained photos from Roberto's and my courtship and early marriage. "Tell me about this one," she said, pointing to a picture of Roberto and me at a church carnival. We looked impossibly young, our faces bright with the kind of unguarded happiness that seemed foreign to me now. I was wearing a yellow sundress that showed off the figure I'd maintained effortlessly in my 20s, before pregnancies and stress eating and years of putting everyone else's needs before my own had changed my body into something I barely recognized. Roberto in the photo wore jeans and a white t-shirt that emphasized the muscular build he'd developed through physical labor. His arm was wrapped around my waist with casual possessiveness, and we were both laughing at something beyond the camera's view. We looked like people who believed their love could conquer anything, who thought the future would unfold exactly as they'd planned. "Your grandfather won me a stuffed elephant at the ring toss game," I told Isabella, settling beside her. "On the carpet. I carried that elephant everywhere for months. I probably still have it somewhere in the attic." "Why don't you have it in your room?" Isabella asked with the direct curiosity of childhood. It was a good question, one I couldn't answer easily. When had I stopped surrounding myself with things that brought me joy? When had I begun storing away the tokens of happiness, saving them for some future moment that never seemed to arrive. I don't know, mija, I said honestly. Maybe we should go find it sometime. We turned the pages slowly, Isabella asking questions about every photo while I provided the stories behind the images. Here was Roberto and me at the beach during our honeymoon, squinting into the California sun. There we were at Sophia's christening, exhausted new parents holding a baby who seemed impossibly small and fragile. A Christmas morning with 2-year-old Sophia and infant Miguel, the living room floor covered in wrapping paper and the chaos of early parenthood. Each photograph told a story of hope and struggle, of small triumphs and daily challenges. I saw myself aging gradually through the images, my face changing from the smooth optimism of youth to the worn determination of middle age. My clothing evolved from trendy outfits that showed personality to practical garments chosen for durability and ease of care. My hairstyles shifted from experimental and fun to the simple, low-maintenance cut I'd worn for the past decade. "You were so beautiful, abuela," Isabella said, studying a photo from my 30s where I was laughing at something off camera while Sophia, about Isabella's current age, hung from my arm. "Was?" I asked, raising an eyebrow with mock indignation. Isabella giggled. "You're still beautiful, but different beautiful. Like, this is young beautiful, and now you're wise beautiful." Wise beautiful. From the mouth of a 7-year-old came a perspective that somehow made me feel better about the changes time had wrought. Perhaps the lines on my face weren't just markers of wear and worry, but evidence of experience and understanding earned through decades of living. We continued through the albums, watching my children grow from babies to toddlers, to school-age kids to teenagers. There were birthday parties and family vacations, school plays and graduation ceremonies. Countless ordinary moments that had seemed so important at the time they were captured. "Where are you in this one?" Isabella asked, pointing to a photo of Roberto, Sophia, and Miguel at some kind of outdoor festival. I studied the image, trying to remember the context. We were all dressed in summer clothes, the kids looked to be in their early teens, but I was nowhere to be seen in the frame. "I must have been taking the picture," I said, though something about that explanation felt incomplete. As we continued through the albums, I began to notice a pattern that hadn't been apparent to me before. In the early photos, from the beginning of our marriage through the children's elementary school years, I appeared regularly alongside Roberto and the kids. But as the years progressed, I appeared less frequently. More and more often, I was the invisible presence behind the camera, documenting my family's life while gradually disappearing from the visual record of our shared history. When had this happened? When had I stopped being a participant in our family's story and become merely its chronicler? When had I begun to see my role as supporting everyone else's experiences rather than creating my own? "Tell me about when." "Mama was little," Isabella requested, turning to a section filled with Sophia's childhood photos. I settled into the familiar rhythm of storytelling, sharing memories of Sophia's fierce independence even as a toddler, her determination to do everything herself, her early fascination with grown-up activities like paying bills and talking on the phone. These were stories I'd told many times over the years, anecdotes that had been polished through repetition until they took on the quality of family mythology. But as I spoke, I realized that most of these stories cast me in the supporting role. I talked about Sophia's achievements, Miguel's milestones, Roberto's work successes, always as the admiring observer rather than as someone with her own accomplishments worth celebrating. "What about you, abuela?" Isabella asked, seeming to sense the gap in my narrative. "What did you want to be when you grew up?" The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me about my own dreams in so long that I'd almost forgotten I'd ever had any. "I wanted to have my own business," I said slowly, surprised by how easily the old dreams surfaced. I was studying accounting in college, and I thought, maybe I could help small businesses with their finances. Be my own boss, you know? Why didn't you? Isabella asked with the straightforward curiosity that only children possess. Well, I had your mama, and then your Uncle Miguel, and there was always so much to do. Your grandfather was working hard to support us, and someone needed to take care of the house and the children. I thought maybe later, when you all were older, but later never came. The sentence hung unfinished between us, filled with all the postponed plans and deferred dreams that had somehow become permanent sacrifices. You could still do it, Isabella said matter-of-factly. My teacher's mom just went back to school and she's really old, like 40. I laughed despite myself. 40 isn't that old, mija. It's older than Mama, Isabella pointed out with 7-year-old logic. And you're older than that, but you're still smart. You help me with my math homework, and you're better at it than Mama sometimes. Out of the mouths of babes, this child saw possibilities where I saw only limitations, potential where I saw only past decisions that couldn't be undone. From downstairs came the sound of cheering from the television, Roberto's voice joining the crowd noise as his team presumably scored. The sound felt distant, coming from a world I wasn't part of, a life that happened parallel to mine without ever intersecting, in meaningful ways. Should we go see if Abuelo wants snacks? Isabella asked, always thinking of others' comfort. That's a sweet idea, I replied, though I suspected Roberto wouldn't welcome the interruption. We made our way downstairs, leaving the photo albums scattered across the hallway floor like pieces of a puzzle I was just beginning to understand. In the kitchen, I prepared a tray with Roberto's favorite crackers, some cheese, and a cold beer, while Isabella arranged everything with the careful attention to presentation that children bring to simple tasks. Abuelo, Isabella called out as we entered the living room. We brought you snacks. Roberto looked up from the game with a brief smile. That's very thoughtful, mija. Thank you. He accepted the tray without really looking at me, his attention already returning to the television screen where players ran across bright green grass under stadium lights that had begun to shine in the early evening darkness. The Dodgers winning? I asked, attempting conversation. Tied in the 7th, Roberto replied without taking his eyes off the screen. I stood there for a moment, holding Isabella's small hand, feeling like a visitor in my own living room. This was my house, my family, my life, but I felt disconnected from all of it, like I was watching someone else's story unfold from a distance. Can we finish looking at pictures? Isabella asked, tugging gently on my hand. Of course, sweetheart. Back in the hallway, we resumed our journey through the visual history of my family. As the afternoon wore on, Isabella's questions became more pointed, more perceptive. She noticed things I'd overlooked during 35 years of living through these moments the first time. Why do you look sad in this one? She asked, pointing to a photo from Miguel's high school graduation. In the picture, I was smiling, but Isabella was right. There was something hollow about the expression, something that didn't reach my eyes. I studied the image, trying to remember what I'd been feeling that day. Miguel was 18, about to leave for culinary school in the city. Sophia was already established in her real estate career, financially independent and emotionally distant. I should have been proud, and I was proud, but I also remember feeling empty. Like the purpose that had driven my daily life for 18 years was about to disappear, leaving me with nothing but household maintenance and a husband who'd grown comfortable with silence. I think I was worried about your Uncle Miguel moving away, I told Isabella, which was true, but incomplete. But he didn't move that far, Isabella pointed out. He still comes to visit. You're right, I agreed. Sometimes grown-ups worry about things that don't turn out to be problems. We reached the final album, which contained photos from the past few years. The images were sparser here, family gatherings becoming less frequent, the spaces between us more noticeable. Christmas mornings where everyone looked at their phones more than at each other. Birthday celebrations that felt obligatory rather than joyful. Recent photos where I appeared even less frequently, as if I'd gradually faded from the frame of my own life. The last photo in the album was from Isabella's 6th birthday party, almost a year ago. She was blowing out candles while Sofia, Miguel, Carmen, and Roberto watched with appropriate smiles. I wasn't in the picture at all, presumably behind the camera once again, documenting everyone else's happiness while remaining invisible myself. "Where were you?" Isabella asked, echoing my own thoughts. "Taking the picture," I replied automatically. "But who took pictures of you?" The question hung in the air between us, highlighting a truth I'd been avoiding for years. No one took pictures of me anymore because no one thought to include me in the moments worth preserving. I'd become the family photographer by default, the one who captured everyone else's experiences while my own went unrecorded. Isabella seemed to sense the weight of this realization. She leaned against me, her small body warm and solid, reminding me that at least one person in this family still saw me as more than just a service provider. "I'll take pictures of you," she announced with the fierce loyalty of childhood. "Mama taught me how to use her phone camera. I'll take lots of pictures so you're in the book too." Her words were a gift, simple and pure, offered without any understanding of how much they meant to me. This 7-year-old child had identified a problem and immediately offered a solution, displaying the kind of empathy and action that the adults in my life had forgotten how to provide. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows through the windows and reminding me that this Mother's Day was drawing to a close. Soon, Roberto would probably want dinner, even though we'd eaten a large lunch. Isabella would need to be entertained until bedtime. Tomorrow would bring the usual routines: laundry and grocery shopping and cleaning, and all the invisible work that kept our household functioning. But something had shifted during these hours, spent looking through old photographs. I'd seen my life from a different perspective, through the eyes of a child who still believed in possibilities, who saw beauty and potential where I'd learned to see only limitations and responsibilities. As we gathered up the photo albums to return them to the closet, I found myself thinking about the woman in those early pictures, the one with dreams of her own business, who'd been studying accounting, who'd believed she could create something meaningful with her life. What had happened to her? When had I stopped being Kim Torres, individual human being with hopes and aspirations, and become simply mom and wife, defined entirely by my relationships to others? The sound of Roberto's cell phone ringing drifted from the living room, followed by his voice answering in the tone he used for work calls. Even on Sunday evening, even on Mother's Day, the outside world intruded on our family time. But then, I realized with a start, there wasn't really any family time to intrude upon. We were all just occupying the same house, going through the motions of togetherness without any real connection. "Abuela," Isabella said as we finished putting away the albums, "can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, mija." She leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Sometimes I think you're lonely." The observation hit me like a physical blow, not because it was untrue, but because it was so perfectly, painfully accurate. This child, with her clear eyes and uncomplicated heart, had seen what the adults in my life had missed or chosen to ignore. I was lonely, profoundly and persistently lonely, despite being surrounded by family. "Why do you think that?" I asked gently. "Because you always take care of everyone else, but nobody takes care of you," Isabella said with the devastating honesty of childhood. "And because you get this look sometimes, like you're far away even when you're right here." I pulled her into a hug, both to comfort her and to hide the tears that had suddenly filled my eyes. How had this child learned to see so clearly? How had she developed such emotional intelligence at only 7 years old? "Thank you for noticing," I whispered into her hair. "It means more than you know that you pay attention to how I'm feeling." "I love you, Abuela," she said simply. Not, Because you do things for me, but because you're you. Because you're you. When had anyone last valued me simply for existing, rather than for the services I provided or the roles I filled? Roberto's voice carried from the living room, still engaged in his work conversation. I could tell from his tone that it was serious, probably some crisis at a job site that would require his attention tomorrow morning. He'd been dealing with more of these problems lately, as younger supervisors took over projects, and older workers like Roberto found themselves struggling to keep up with new technologies and changing industry standards. At 59, Roberto was facing his own challenges, his own fears about relevance and purpose. His body was showing the wear of decades in construction, his back aching more frequently, his hands stiff in the mornings. The world was changing around him in ways that sometimes left him feeling lost and uncertain, though he'd never admit it aloud. Perhaps his distance from me wasn't entirely about our relationship. Perhaps he was dealing with his own sense of displacement, his own questions about who he was beyond the roles that had defined him for so many years. We'd been so focused on maintaining the surface of our lives that we'd stopped digging deeper, stopped asking each other how we really felt about the changes happening within us and around us. Isabella and I made our way downstairs as Roberto's phone call ended. He sat in his recliner, staring at the television where the game continued, but his expression was distant, troubled. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Problem with the foundation pour tomorrow," he said without looking at me. "Might have to bring in extra crew, which means budget issues, which means the project manager breathing down my neck all week." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. "That sounds stressful." He nodded but didn't elaborate, returning his attention to the game as if the conversation was complete. This was how most of our interactions went lately. Brief exchanges of practical information without any real emotional connection. Isabella, however, wasn't satisfied with adult distance. She climbed into Roberto's lap with the confidence of a beloved granddaughter, settling against his chest with casual affection. "Abuelo, tell me about when you were little," she said, using the same direct approach that had worked so well with me. Roberto's face softened as it always did when Isabella was near. She had a gift for bringing out the gentler side of people, for creating connection through simple presence and genuine interest. "What do you want to know, mija?" he asked, adjusting his position so she'd be more comfortable. "Were you brave when you were my age?" Roberto chuckled, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him all day. I thought I was brave, but looking back, I was probably just foolish. I was always getting into trouble, climbing trees that were too tall, jumping over streams that were too wide. "Like adventures," Isabella said approvingly. "Like adventures," Roberto agreed, though your abuela probably has a different word for it. He glanced at me then, and for a moment, our eyes met with something approaching the warmth that used to exist between us. We'd shared many conversations over the years, about Roberto's childhood mishaps, stories that had become part of our family folklore. There had been a time when we'd reminisced together, when we'd found joy in sharing memories and building on each other's recollections. "Tell her about the time you got stuck in the Hernandez's chimney," I suggested, settling onto the couch near his chair. "Oh no," Roberto groaned dramatically for Isabella's benefit. "Your abuela wants me to tell you about my most embarrassing moment." "Yes!" Isabella clapped her hands together. "Tell me!" As Roberto launched into the familiar story of his 8-year-old attempt to play Santa Claus at a neighbor's house, I found myself relaxing for the first time all day. This was what I'd been hoping for: genuine family time, shared laughter, the kind of connection that felt natural rather than forced. Isabella was the catalyst for this moment, her presence somehow making it safe for Roberto and me to interact, without the weight of unspoken disappointments and accumulated resentments. Through her eyes, we could remember who we used to be, both individually and together. The story continued, with Roberto embellishing details for Isabella's entertainment, and me adding corrections and additional context the way I had for 37 years. For a few minutes, we felt like a team again, partners in the important work of passing down family history to the next generation. And that's how I learned that chimneys are for smoke, not for little boys, Roberto concluded, earning delighted giggles from Isabella. Tell another one, she demanded with the insatiable appetite for stories that all children possess. I think that's enough embarrassing stories about your abuelo for one day, I said with mock seriousness. We need to save some for next time. Next time. The phrase implied a future where we'd gather again like this, where Isabella would ask for stories and Roberto would indulge her with the patience he'd somehow lost for adult conversation. I hoped there would be many next times, but I wasn't entirely confident. The moments of genuine connection had become increasingly rare in our family. As the evening progressed, we settled into a comfortable routine. Isabella colored in a book she'd brought from home while Roberto and I watched the end of the baseball game together. We didn't talk much, but the silence felt less oppressive than usual, softened by Isabella's presence and the shared experience of storytelling. When hunger struck, I prepared a simple dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, comfort food that satisfied without requiring much effort. Isabella helped by setting the table and carrying plates, tasks she approached with the seriousness of important responsibility. This is my favorite dinner, Isabella announced as we sat down to eat. Better than the fancy restaurant food from lunch? I asked, smiling. Way better, she confirmed. This tastes like love. Tastes like love. Another of those profound observations that children make without realizing their impact. This simple meal, prepared with care in my own kitchen, meant more to Isabella than the expensive lunch that had felt so hollow and disconnected. After dinner, we played board games while Roberto dozed in his chair, the combination of food and beer and emotional exhaustion finally catching up with him. Isabella was a gracious winner and loser, celebrating her victories with appropriate enthusiasm and accepting defeats with good humor. As bedtime approached, I helped Isabella into her pajamas and brushed her teeth, following the same routine I'd established with my own children decades earlier. These small rituals of care and comfort felt more meaningful than any grand gesture, more authentic than any expensive celebration. Abuela, Isabella said as I tucked her into the bed in Sophia's old room. Today was the best Mother's Day ever. Really? I asked, surprised. Even though we didn't do anything special? We did do something special, Isabella insisted. We looked at pictures and told stories and played games and had dinner that tastes like love. That's all special. From a 7-year-old came wisdom that eluded the adults in my life. Special wasn't about expensive restaurants or elaborate plans or impressive gifts. Special was about attention and presence and genuine connection. Special was about being seen and valued for who you are, not just what you can provide. As Isabella drifted off to sleep, I sat beside her bed for a few minutes, watching her peaceful face in the dim light from the hallway. This child had given me something precious today, the reminder that I was worth knowing, worth spending time with, worth loving simply for being myself. Downstairs, Roberto was still sleeping in his chair, the television casting flickering light across his face. I turned off the game and covered him with the afghan my mother had crocheted years ago, a gesture of care that felt automatic after so many years of marriage. But as I performed this small act of service, I found myself really looking at my husband for the first time in months. His face, relaxed in sleep, showed the stress lines that had deepened over the past few years. His hair, now more gray than black, was thinning at the crown. His hands, folded across his chest, were scarred and calloused from decades of physical labor. This was the man I'd fallen in love with 39 years ago, though both of us had changed so much that sometimes I felt like I was living with a stranger. We'd grown older together without growing closer, sharing a house and a history without maintaining the emotional intimacy that had once sustained us. When had we stopped talking about our dreams? When had we stopped asking each other how we felt about the changes in our lives? When had we become merely functional partners rather than romantic companions? Standing in my living room on Mother's Day evening, surrounded by the familiar objects that marked my domestic life, I felt the weight of all the choices I'd made and unmade over the years. The woman in those early photographs had been full of potential, eager for the future, confident in her ability to create something meaningful with her life. What would that young woman think of who I'd become? Would she be proud of the family I'd raised, the home I'd maintained, the sacrifices I'd made for others' benefit? Or would she be disappointed by the dreams deferred, the possibilities unexplored, the gradual erasure of her individual identity? I made my way upstairs to our bedroom, the house quiet except for Roberto's soft snoring from the living room and Isabella's gentle breathing from down the hall. In the bathroom mirror, I saw a woman approaching her 63rd birthday, someone who'd spent the majority of her adult life caring for others without ever stopping to ask what she might want for herself. But Isabella's words echoed in my mind as I prepared for bed. You could still do it. This child believed in possibilities that I'd forgotten existed. She saw potential where I saw only limitations, hope where I saw only resignation. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Roberto's side remained empty and cold, I found myself thinking about those business classes I'd loved in college. I remembered the satisfaction of balancing accounts, the thrill of solving financial puzzles, the dreams I'd had of helping small business owners navigate the complexities of taxes and bookkeeping. Were those dreams completely impossible, or had I simply convinced myself they were? At 62, did I still have time to reclaim some version of the life I'd planned before motherhood and marriage reshaped my priorities? The questions kept me awake long into the night, stirring feelings I'd buried under decades of routine and responsibility. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a different future, one where I was more than just someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's grandmother. But imagination and action were two different things. Even if I wanted to change my life, even if I wanted to pursue delayed dreams, I was trapped by practical realities, financial dependence, family obligations, the simple fact that I'd been out of the workforce for 35 years. Or was I trapped? The question lingered as I finally drifted off to sleep, carrying with it possibilities I hadn't dared to consider in decades. Monday morning arrived with the persistent buzz of Roberto's alarm clock at 5:30, a sound that had marked the beginning of my days for 37 years. He moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision: shower, coffee, toast with butter and jam, work clothes that I'd laid out the night before. We exchanged perhaps a dozen words, mostly about the weather and his schedule, before he left for the construction site that would consume his attention for the next 10 hours. Isabella slept peacefully in Sophia's old room, exhausted from yesterday's activities and the emotional intensity of a 7-year-old processing family dynamics she couldn't fully understand. I moved quietly through the house, starting a load of laundry and preparing for another week of the same routines that had structured my life for decades. But something felt different. The questions that had kept me awake the night before lingered in my consciousness like background music. Impossible to ignore completely. As I folded Roberto's work shirts, I found myself wondering what it would feel like to dress for my own job, to have somewhere important to be, something meaningful to accomplish beyond maintaining the invisible infrastructure of domestic life. The coffee tasted bitter that morning, or perhaps I was just more aware of its shortcomings. I'd been buying the same brand for 20 years because it was Roberto's preference, never considering whether I might enjoy something different. Such a small thing, but it represented something larger, the gradual erosion of my individual preferences in favor of family harmony. By 8 o'clock, Isabella was awake and dressed, chattering about school while she ate the cereal I'd poured for her. She had inherited Sophia's morning energy, bouncing from topic to topic with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me how much joy I'd found in my children's early years. "Can we look at more pictures tonight?" Isabella asked as I braided her Hair. If you want to, I replied, touched by her continued interest in my history. Though you might get bored hearing the same old stories. I won't get bored, Isabella said with the certainty of childhood. Every story is different when you tell it because you remember new things each time. Out of the mouths of babes. This child understood something about memory and narrative that most adults had forgotten. That stories evolve in the telling, revealing new layers of meaning as our perspectives shift with time and experience. Sophia arrived at 8:30 to collect Isabella for school, looking polished and professional in a cream-colored blazer and matching skirt. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the early hour. She moved with the confident efficiency of someone who'd mastered the complex choreography of single motherhood and career success. "Thanks for keeping Isabella overnight," Sophia said, checking her phone while Isabella gathered her backpack and school supplies. "How was the rest of your Mother's Day?" "Quiet," I replied. "We looked at photo albums and played games." "That's nice," Sophia said absently, her attention already divided between multiple text conversations and whatever crisis awaited her at the office. "I need to run, showing 3 houses this morning and I can't be late." She kissed Isabella, "Goodbye," and headed for the door without any real acknowledgement of our conversation, leaving me standing in the entryway feeling like a service provider whose contract had been completed satisfactorily. "Bye, Abuela," Isabella called from the car window as they pulled away. "I love you." "I love you too, Mia," I called back, waving until their car disappeared around the corner. The house settled into silence around me, a quiet that felt heavier than usual after the warmth of Isabella's presence. I had the entire day ahead of me with no obligations beyond the usual housework, no schedule to maintain beyond my own preferences. This freedom should have felt liberating. But instead, it highlighted the emptiness that had crept into my daily existence. I found myself wandering through rooms that suddenly seemed too large, too clean, too organized. The living room where Roberto and Isabella and I had shared stories the night before felt hollow in the morning light. The kitchen where we'd eaten dinner together looked lonely without voices and laughter to fill the space. This was what my days looked like now that my children were grown and Roberto was absorbed in his own concerns. Hours of maintenance activities interspersed with brief moments of connection, mostly centered around meals and practical discussions about schedules and responsibilities. But the restlessness that had kept me awake the night before refused to be quieted by familiar routines. As I sorted through Roberto's work clothes, separating items that needed repairs from those that could be washed normally, I found myself really examining the life I'd built around service to others. Every task I performed existed to make someone else's life easier. Roberto's shirts were ironed so he could look professional at work. The grocery shopping was planned around everyone's preferences except my own. The house was cleaned and organized to create a peaceful environment for a family that spent most of their time elsewhere. When had this begun to feel like a problem, rather than a purpose? When had I started questioning the value of work that had once felt meaningful and important? I made my way to Roberto's study, a small room off the living room that had served as his home office for the past 15 years. The space was typically masculine: dark wood furniture, filing cabinets filled with work documents, a desk covered with papers related to construction projects and household finances. I rarely entered this room except to dust and vacuum, respecting Roberto's need for a space that was entirely his own. But this morning, something drew me to examine the environment where he managed the practical aspects of our shared life. The desk was covered with invoices and receipts, bank statements and insurance documents, all the paperwork that accumulated around home ownership and family responsibilities. Roberto handled most of our financial affairs, a division of labor that had developed naturally in the early years of our marriage when I was focused on childcare and he was establishing his career. But as I straightened the papers, organizing them into neater piles, I began to notice patterns that surprised me. bills that were addressed to both of us, insurance policies where my name appeared first, investment statements showing accounts I didn't remember opening. Curious, I sat down at Roberto's desk and began to examine the documents more carefully. What I discovered over the next hour fundamentally changed my understanding of my own financial situation. The house deed, which I found in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, listed both our names as owners, but the mortgage had been paid off 3 years ago using funds from an inheritance I'd received when my father died. I'd signed the papers at the time, but Roberto had handled all the details, and I'd assumed the house was primarily his responsibility. The investment accounts that funded Roberto's retirement planning were in both our names, established using money I'd inherited from my mother's estate 5 years earlier. Again, I'd signed documents without paying close attention to the details, trusting Roberto to manage investments that would benefit our shared future. Most shocking of all was the discovery of a business license and tax documents showing that Roberto's construction company was actually registered as a joint partnership, with me listed as co-owner. The business had been struggling in recent years, but the assets and client relationships we'd built over 2 decades represented significant value. I sat in Roberto's chair, surrounded by papers that told a story I'd never fully understood. On paper, I wasn't the financially dependent housewife I'd assumed myself to be. I was a property owner, an investor, a business partner with legal rights and economic power I'd never recognized or exercised. How had this happened without my awareness? How had I signed documents and made financial decisions without understanding their implications? The answer was both simple and disturbing. I'd abdicated responsibility for my own economic security, trusting Roberto to handle details I'd convinced myself were too complicated for me to understand. But the documents spread across the desk proved otherwise. My name was on everything important because I'd been contributing to everything important, both financially and practically, for decades. The inheritance money that had funded our major purchases, the unpaid labor that had kept our household functioning while Roberto focused on his career, the emotional and practical support that had enabled him to build a business while I managed everything else. I was not the dependent partner in this marriage. I was an equal contributor whose contributions had been systematically minimized and overlooked, even by myself. The realization was both empowering and terrifying. If I truly was a co-owner of our major assets, then I had options I'd never considered. If I was legally entitled to half of everything we'd built together, then I wasn't trapped by financial dependence the way I'd always assumed. But with recognition came responsibility. If I owned half of everything, then I also bore half the liability for Roberto's business debts, half the obligation for maintaining our shared assets, half the risk if his construction company failed. I spent the rest of the morning reading through documents, slowly piecing together a complete picture of our financial situation. We were comfortable but not wealthy, secure but not immune to economic downturns. Roberto's business provided steady income, but it was vulnerable to market fluctuations and the physical limitations that came with his aging body. The inheritance money from my parents had provided the foundation for our current stability, but Roberto's careful management had grown those initial investments into something substantial. We owned our home outright, had retirement savings that would support us in later years, and possessed business assets that could be sold if necessary. But I also discovered debts I hadn't known about, loans Roberto had taken against the business, to cover operating expenses, credit cards that carried balances from months when construction projects had been delayed or canceled. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to suggest that our financial picture was more complex than I'd realized. Knowledge, I was learning, was both a gift and a burden. Ignorance had allowed me to avoid responsibility for difficult decisions, but it had also left me powerless to influence outcomes that affected my own future. As I returned the documents to their proper files, I found myself thinking about the accounting classes I'd taken in college, the skills I'd developed before pregnancy redirected my path. Those abilities hadn't disappeared. They'd simply been dormant, waiting for an opportunity to prove their relevance. Could I contribute more actively to managing our family's finances? Could I use the knowledge I was gaining to help Roberto navigate the challenges facing his business? Could I transform myself from passive beneficiary to active partner in our economic life? The questions excited and intimidated me in equal measure. Taking control of my financial situation would require admitting how much I'd ignored over the years. It would mean challenging the division of responsibilities that had defined our marriage for decades. It would require Roberto to accept me as an equal partner rather than a dependent spouse. But it would also mean reclaiming agency over my own future, developing skills that had been neglected for too long, creating value through my own efforts rather than simply supporting Roberto's endeavors. I was so absorbed in these thoughts that I didn't hear Roberto's truck in the driveway. He appeared in the doorway of his study, looking surprised to find me sitting at his desk, surrounded by financial documents. "What are you doing?" he asked, and there was an edge to his voice that suggested displeasure with my intrusion into his domain. "Looking at our finances," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the guilty feeling his question provoked. "Why?" Roberto moved into the room, his body language protective of the space I'd invaded. "Is there a problem?" "I realized I don't really understand our financial situation," I said honestly. "I thought it was time to learn more about what we own and what we owe." Roberto's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like suspicion. "You've never been interested in this stuff before. You always said it was boring." Had I said that? Probably I had. In the early years when I was overwhelmed with childcare responsibilities and grateful to have Roberto handle one less area of complexity. But characterizing my lack of involvement as disinterest rather than circumstantial avoidance felt unfair. "Things change," I said carefully. "I have more time now, and I think I should understand our situation better. I handle everything fine," Roberto said, beginning to gather papers into stacks. "You don't need to worry about this." But I did need to worry about it, I realized. These were my assets too, my future too, my security too. Abdicating responsibility hadn't served me well, and I was no longer willing to remain ignorant about my own financial circumstances. "I found some things I didn't know about," I said, watching Roberto's face carefully. "Loans against the business, credit card debt. When were you planning to discuss these with me?" Roberto's jaw tightened, and he stopped organizing papers to look directly at me. "Those are temporary situations. Nothing you need to stress about." "But I am stressed about them," I replied, "because they affect both of us, and I had no idea they existed." The conversation was heading toward conflict, something both Roberto and I had spent years avoiding through careful emotional distance and division of responsibilities. But avoidance had created its own problems, leaving us uninformed about each other's concerns and unprepared for honest communication about difficult topics. "Why are you bringing this up now?" Roberto asked. "What's changed?" It was a fair question, one I wasn't sure how to answer completely. What had changed was my willingness to accept ignorance as a viable long-term strategy. What had changed was my recognition that I'd been abdicating responsibility for my own future. What had changed was my understanding that I had more power and options than I'd realized. "I've been thinking about what I want my life to look like," I said slowly. "About what I'm capable of contributing beyond cooking and cleaning." Roberto stared at me for a long moment, processing this unexpected development in our carefully structured relationship. "Are you saying you're not happy?" The question hung between us, weighted with 37 years of shared history and accumulated assumptions. Was I happy? The answer was complex, involving satisfactions and regrets that couldn't be reduced to a simple yes or no. "I'm saying I want to be more involved in the decisions that affect my life," I replied. "I want to understand what we own and what we owe. I want to contribute to planning for our future instead of just hoping you'll handle everything correctly." Roberto's face showed a mixture of emotions I couldn't easily interpret. Hurt that I was questioning his management of our affairs, relief that I was finally willing to share responsibility for difficult decisions, anxiety about what other changes might follow if I continued questioning our established patterns. "Fine," he said finally. "If you want to know about the finances, I'll show you everything. But don't blame me if you don't like what you find." It wasn't the most gracious invitation to partnership, but it was an opening. And I was learning that openings, however small, were precious opportunities that shouldn't be wasted. Over the next hour, Roberto walked me through our complete financial picture, explaining the reasoning behind decisions he'd made unilaterally, sharing concerns he'd been carrying alone. The business loans were necessary to cover payroll during a slow winter. The credit card debt had accumulated during a period when 3 major projects were delayed simultaneously, creating cash flow problems that lasted for months. None of it was catastrophic, but all of it was more precarious than I'd realized. Roberto had been making financial decisions under pressure, trying to maintain stability while protecting me from worry about circumstances beyond our control. "Why didn't you tell me about these problems?" I asked when he finished his explanation. Roberto shrugged, suddenly looking older than his 59 years. "What was the point? You couldn't solve them, and I didn't want you to worry about things you couldn't change." But I could have solved some of them, I realized. My inheritance money was sitting in conservative investments, earning modest returns while Roberto borrowed money at higher interest rates to cover short-term cash flow problems. I had accounting skills that could help him analyze his business operations more effectively, identify cost savings and efficiency improvements that might prevent future financial stress. I could have been a partner instead of a dependent, if either of us had been willing to challenge the roles we'd accepted without examination. "I want to help," I said. "Not just with the housework and meals, but with this. With the business and the finances and planning for our future." Roberto looked skeptical. "You haven't worked in 35 years. Business is different now. Everything's computerized, regulated differently." He was right about the changes, but wrong about my capacity to adapt. The basic principles of accounting and financial management hadn't changed, even if the tools and regulations had evolved. I could learn new systems if I applied myself, update skills that had been dormant rather than lost. "I could take some classes," I suggested. "Get up to speed on current practices, learn the software you use for the business." Roberto's expression softened slightly. Perhaps he was beginning to see possibilities rather than just problems. That would take time and money. "We have time," I pointed out. "And investing in education is better than paying interest on debt we could avoid with better planning." The logic was sound, but logic wasn't the only factor influencing Roberto's response. Accepting my help would mean acknowledging that he couldn't handle everything alone, that the division of labor we'd maintained for decades was no longer serving either of us effectively. It would also mean treating me as an equal partner rather than a dependent spouse, sharing power and decision-making authority he'd grown accustomed to wielding unilaterally. That kind of change would require emotional adjustments that might be more difficult than learning new business software. "Let me think about it," Roberto said finally, which felt like progress even if it wasn't enthusiastic agreement. We spent the rest of the afternoon working together to organize his financial records, creating systems that would make it easier to track business expenses and personal finances separately. It was detailed, methodical work that reminded me how much I'd enjoyed the precision and logic of accounting principles. As we worked, Roberto began to relax, perhaps recognizing that my interest in our finances wasn't a criticism of his management, but a genuine desire to contribute meaningfully to our shared future. He started explaining business challenges in more detail, asking for my opinions on problems he'd been wrestling with alone. "The Martinelli project is running over budget," he said, showing me invoices that revealed how material costs had exceeded initial estimates. "I can absorb the loss this time, but I need to figure out better cost controls for future jobs. I studied the numbers, thinking about markup formulas and contingency planning strategies I'd learned decades ago. What if you built buffer percentages into your initial bids? Small enough to stay competitive but large enough to cover unexpected expenses. Roberto looked up from the papers with surprise. That's actually a good idea. Most of my competitors probably do something similar. Of course they did. Roberto was skilled at the physical aspects of construction, but he'd learned business management through trial and error rather than formal training. I could help him develop more sophisticated planning strategies, drawing on educational background he'd never had the opportunity to acquire. I could research industry standards, I offered. Figure out what other contractors do for pricing and project management. You'd be willing to do that? The question revealed how little Roberto understood about my intellectual curiosity, my capacity for learning, my desire to contribute meaningfully to our shared enterprise. I'd been defined for so long by domestic responsibilities that even he had forgotten I possessed other capabilities. I'd enjoy doing that, I said honestly. It would be nice to use my brain for something besides meal planning and laundry schedules. Roberto laughed, the first genuine expression of humor I'd heard from him in months. I forget sometimes that you're actually pretty smart. Pretty smart. It wasn't the most flattering compliment, but it suggested recognition that I possessed intellectual abilities beyond household management. It was a beginning, a crack in the assumptions that had shaped our relationship for decades. As evening approached, we'd made significant progress organizing Roberto's business records and identifying areas where my involvement might be beneficial. More importantly, we'd begun a conversation about our future that felt more honest and collaborative than any we'd shared in years. But I was also discovering that knowledge came with unexpected burdens. Understanding our financial situation meant recognizing how vulnerable our security was to factors beyond our control. Roberto's aging body, market fluctuations, changes. In the construction industry, unexpected health expenses, any of these could threaten the stability we'd worked decades to achieve. Ignorance had provided a kind of protection from these anxieties. Knowledge required me to confront the reality that our future was less certain than I'd assumed, more dependent on continued good fortune than I'd understood. As I prepared dinner, that evening I found myself thinking about the day's discoveries in broader context. The financial documents had revealed not just assets and liabilities, but the extent to which I'd been excluded from decisions that shaped my own life. The woman whose name appeared on deeds and investment accounts and business licenses had been a legal fiction, present on paper, but absent from the actual exercise of power and responsibility. But legal fictions could become practical realities if I chose to claim the authority that had always been mine on paper. The question was whether I had the courage to transform myself from passive beneficiary to active participant in my own life. Roberto emerged from his study carrying his laptop, settling at the kitchen table while I finished cooking. This was unusual. He typically spent evenings watching television or working on household maintenance projects, avoiding the kitchen during meal preparation. "I've been thinking about what you said," he announced without preamble. "About taking classes, learning the business software." I set down the wooden spoon I'd been using to stir sauce, giving him my full attention. "And? There's a community college program for small business management," Roberto said, opening his laptop. "Weeknight classes, designed for working adults. Covers accounting software, tax planning, project management." He'd researched this during the time I'd been cooking dinner, moving from skepticism to serious consideration in the space of a few hours. The speed of his attitude shift surprised me, suggesting that he'd been thinking about these issues longer than he'd admitted. "You think I should apply?" I asked carefully. "I think we should both apply," Roberto said, looking up from the computer screen. "I could use some formal training too. Maybe it's time we both learn to do this right." The suggestion was more than I dared to hope for. Not just permission to educate myself, but an invitation to partnership. a recognition that we both had room for growth and learning. That would be expensive, I pointed out, though I was already calculating how we could afford tuition for both of us. Less expensive than making mistakes because we don't know what we're doing, Roberto replied pragmatically. And if it helps us run the business better, it'll pay for itself. He was right, of course, but the practical benefits were only part of what made this opportunity appealing. The chance to be a student again, to engage my mind with new challenges, to develop skills that would make me a more valuable partner, these prospects excited me in ways I hadn't felt in decades. When do classes start? I asked, moving closer to see the computer screen. Fall semester begins in August, Roberto said, scrolling through course descriptions. 16 weeks, 2 nights a week. We could both take the introductory sequence, then specialize based on what we learn. August was 4 months away, enough time to prepare mentally and practically for this major change in my routine and identity. Enough time to think seriously about what I wanted to achieve through formal education, what kind of person I wanted to become through this process of learning and growth. But it was also soon enough to feel real, concrete, achievable rather, than merely theoretical. I could envision myself sitting in a classroom again, taking notes, participating in discussions, completing assignments that mattered to my future, rather than just passing time until the next domestic crisis required. My attention, I'd like to try, I said simply. Roberto smiled, the first time I'd seen that expression directed at me rather than past me in months. Then let's do it. As we worked together to clear the dinner dishes, I felt something shift in the atmosphere between us. Not a return to the romance of our early years, but something better suited to this stage of our lives. A sense of shared purpose, mutual respect, collaborative planning for a future we'd create together rather than simply endure. In parallel, the evening felt different too. Instead of retiring to separate activities, we spent time researching the college program, discussing what we might learn, imagining how new knowledge could improve both our business operations and our personal relationship. It wasn't the dramatic transformation I'd been fantasizing about during my sleepless night, but it was change in a direction that felt sustainable and meaningful. Growth that built on our existing foundation rather than requiring us to abandon everything we'd created together. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the woman I'd been yesterday morning, passive, resigned, convinced that her life was essentially complete, except for the slow decline toward old age and irrelevance. That woman had been replaced by someone who owned property, held business interests, possessed legal authority she'd never exercised. More importantly, that woman had been replaced by someone who was ready to claim responsibility for her own future, to develop capabilities that had been dormant too long, to become an active participant in creating the life she wanted, rather than simply accepting the life that had happened to her. The transformation wasn't complete. It had barely begun, but for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. Excited about possibilities that extended beyond managing other people's needs and expectations. Change was coming, whether I initiated it or simply adapted to circumstances, beyond my control. The question was whether I'd meet that change as a passive victim or an active agent of my own destiny. Lying in bed beside Roberto, listening to his steady breathing as he slept, I felt grateful for the unexpected gift of this new beginning. At 62, I was finally ready to discover who I might become if I stopped limiting myself to who I'd always been. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of research and preparation. Roberto and I had submitted our applications to the community college business program, and while we waited for acceptance letters, I threw myself into learning everything I could about modern business practices. The public library became my second home, where I spent hours reading about small business management, construction industry trends, and accounting software systems. What surprised me most was how quickly the knowledge came back. The analytical skills I'd developed in college hadn't disappeared. They'd simply been waiting for an opportunity to resurface. Numbers made sense to me in ways they never had to Roberto. Patterns emerged from financial data that told stories about cash flow and seasonal fluctuations and market opportunities. Roberto began including me in business conversations with increasing frequency. When potential clients called to discuss projects, he'd put them on speaker so I could listen and take notes. When suppliers offered new pricing structures, he'd ask for my opinion on whether the deals made financial sense. Slowly, gradually, I was becoming a real partner in the enterprise that bore both our names. But the most significant change was in how I saw myself. The woman who had felt invisible and irrelevant just a month ago was discovering strengths and capabilities she'd forgotten she possessed. I wasn't just Roberto's wife or Sophia's mother or Isabella's grandmother. I was Kim Torres, a person with her own thoughts and skills and potential. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. With agency came responsibility. With knowledge came the burden of making difficult decisions. With power came the risk of making mistakes that could affect our entire future. One afternoon in early June, while Roberto was meeting with a potential client about a major commercial project, I was in his study organizing tax documents when Sophia called. Her voice carried the stress that had become increasingly common in our conversations, the sound of someone juggling too many responsibilities. Without adequate support, "Mom, I need a huge favor," she said without preamble. "Can you pick up Isabella from school today? My biggest client just called an emergency meeting about a property that's supposed to close tomorrow, and I can't reschedule." "Of course," I replied, checking the clock. "What time does she get out?" 3:15. "And Mom, could you maybe keep her until after dinner? This meeting could run late, and I don't want to rush if we're trying to save a six-figure commission." Six-figure commission. Sophia's success continued to astound me. The way she'd built a career that provided financial security I'd never imagined possible for a woman raising a child alone. But that success came at a cost. Long hours, constant stress, the pressure to prioritize work over family whenever conflicts arose. "She can spend the night if you need," I offered. "You know I love having her here." "You're a lifesaver, Mom. I owe you big time." After Sophia hung up, I sat in Roberto's chair thinking about the conversation. My daughter was successful, independent, everything I'd wanted her to become. But she was also stretched thin, struggling to balance professional demands with single motherhood, constantly choosing between career advancement and family time. Had I made the right choice 35 years ago when I'd decided to focus on family rather than career? Or had Sophia made the right choice by prioritizing financial independence over domestic stability? Perhaps there wasn't a right choice, only different paths with different costs and benefits. I picked up Isabella from school that afternoon, enjoying her excited chatter about a science project involving growing bean plants in different soil conditions. Her teacher had praised her hypothesis about how fertilizer would affect growth rates, and Isabella was eager to test her theories at home. "Can we plant some beans in your garden, Abuela?" she asked as we walked to my car. "I want to see if the results are the same outside of school." "Absolutely," I replied, charmed by her scientific curiosity. "We can start a whole experiment section in the backyard." As we drove home, Isabella told me about her friends and her classes, her plans for summer vacation, her dreams of becoming a scientist who discovers new medicines to help sick people. Her ambitions were vast and confident, unmarked by the self-doubt that seemed to plague so many women my age. "You can be anything you want," I told her, meaning every word. "The world is different now than when I was young. You'll have opportunities I never dreamed of." "What did you want to be when you were my age?" Isabella asked, the same question that had surprised me during our Mother's Day photo session. "I wanted to run my own business," I said, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "Help other people manage their money and plan for the future." "You still could," Isabella said with the matter-of-fact optimism of childhood. Mama says it's never too late to follow your dreams. Follow your dreams. Sophia had taught her daughter to believe in possibilities that I'd been trained to see as unrealistic fantasies. The contrast between generations was stark. Isabella expected to have choices where I'd learned to accept limitations. At home, we spent the afternoon in the garden, planting bean seeds in carefully labeled rows while discussing variables and control groups with the seriousness of professional researchers. Isabella approached the project with methodical precision, measuring distances between plants and recording data in a notebook she'd brought from school. Science is about asking questions and finding answers, she explained as she watered our experimental plots. Mrs. Rodriguez says the best scientists are the ones who keep wondering about how things work. Keep wondering. When had I stopped? Wondering about how things worked, about how life might be different, about what possibilities existed beyond my current circumstances. When had I begun accepting answers instead of asking questions? Roberto arrived home while we were washing, soil from our hands at the kitchen sink. He looked tired but pleased, the expression he wore after productive business meetings. How did it go? I asked, drying Isabella's hands with a dish towel. Good news, Roberto said, kissing my cheek in a gesture of affection that had become rare over the years. The Riverside Shopping Center wants us to bid on their renovation project. 18 months of steady work if we get the contract. That's wonderful, I said, understanding the significance. Large commercial projects provided the kind of stable income that could carry Roberto's business through the unpredictable cycles that had caused so much financial stress. There's a catch, though, Roberto continued, opening a beer and settling at the kitchen table. They want detailed cost projections, project timelines, references from similar jobs, professional presentation materials. I could hear the anxiety beneath his excitement. Roberto was skilled at construction work, but elaborate presentations required skills he'd never developed. In the past, he'd relied on personal relationships and word-of-mouth referrals to generate business. Competing for major contracts required a different level of sophistication. We can handle that, I said, the word we emerging naturally. I've been researching project management software, and I found some programs that create professional reports automatically once you input the basic data. Roberto looked surprised, then grateful. You'd be willing to help with the presentation? I'd be excited to help, I replied honestly. This was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been hoping for, an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to our shared enterprise, to use skills I was developing, to be part of something important rather than just supporting from the sidelines. Over dinner, we discussed the project requirements while Isabella listened with the intense focus she brought to adult conversations. Roberto had already visited the site and estimated material costs, but he needed help organizing information into the professional format the client expected. I could create spreadsheets for cost breakdowns, I suggested, charts showing timeline, projections, maybe even some graphics showing before and after scenarios. You know how to do all that? Roberto asked, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. I'm learning, I replied. The library has computer classes for seniors, and I've been practicing with presentation software. It felt good to surprise Roberto with my capabilities, to demonstrate that I was developing skills rather than simply existing in the same patterns that had defined our relationship for decades. More importantly, it felt good to contribute something valuable to our shared future, rather than simply managing the domestic infrastructure that enabled his success. After dinner, while Isabella worked on homework at the kitchen table, Roberto and I spread his project notes across the dining room table and began organizing information for the presentation. It was detailed, methodical work that required both his practical knowledge and my analytical skills. The key is showing them we understand their specific needs, I said, reading through the client's requirements document. Not just generic construction capabilities, but solutions to their particular challenges. Roberto nodded, beginning to see how my approach differed from his usual methods. I usually just tell people what I can do and let them decide if they want it. That works for smaller jobs, I agreed. But for something this size, they want to see that we've thought through their problems and developed targeted solutions. We worked for 3 hours, creating detailed cost projections and timeline charts that transformed Roberto's handwritten notes into professional documentation. The process reminded me how much I enjoyed problem solving, the satisfaction of organizing complex information into clear, logical presentations. "This looks incredible," Roberto said, reviewing the preliminary materials we'd assembled. "Much more professional than anything I've submitted before." "We make a good team," I replied, and meant it. This collaboration felt natural in ways our marriage hadn't for years. Two people with complementary skills working toward shared goals, each contributing something valuable to their combined effort. Isabella looked up from her math homework with sleepy eyes. "Are you starting a business together?" "We already have a business together," Roberto explained. "Your abuela is helping me make it better." "That's cool," Isabella said matter-of-factly. "Mama says the best businesses happen when people help each other instead of trying to do everything alone." Out of the mouths of babes again. This 7-year-old understood something about collaboration and partnership that Roberto and I had taken decades to discover. That individual strengths became more powerful when combined effectively with someone else's complementary abilities. As we put Isabella to bed that night, I felt more optimistic about our future than I had in years. The presentation project had given us a shared focus that brought out the best in both of us, a common goal that required cooperation and mutual respect. But I was also beginning to understand that my growing involvement in Roberto's business was changing our relationship in ways neither of us had fully anticipated. I was no longer the supportive spouse who managed domestic responsibilities while he handled everything important. I was becoming an equal partner with my own opinions and expertise and decision-making authority. That shift would require adjustments from both of us. Roberto would need to share control he'd exercised alone for decades, and I would need to accept responsibility for outcomes rather than simply supporting his efforts. The transformation wouldn't be easy, but it felt necessary and exciting. 3 days later, Roberto received devastating news that changed everything we'd been planning. He came home from a doctor's appointment looking pale and shaken, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd received information that fundamentally altered his understanding of the future. "We need to talk," he said, settling heavily into his kitchen chair while I finished preparing lunch. The tone of his voice triggered immediate anxiety. In 37 years of marriage, Roberto had never begun a conversation with those particular words unless something was seriously wrong. "What happened?" I asked, abandoning the sandwich I'd been making to give him my full attention. "Dr. Martinez wants me to see a specialist," Roberto said slowly. "The x-rays from my back injury last month showed some things that concern him." Back injury. Roberto had been moving more stiffly than usual, complaining about soreness after long days on construction sites, but I'd assumed it was normal wear and tear from decades of physical labor. The possibility of something more serious hadn't occurred to me. "What kind of specialist?" I asked, sitting down across from him. "Orthopedic surgeon. He thinks I might need surgery to prevent permanent nerve damage, maybe sooner rather than later." Surgery. The word carried implications that neither of us wanted to examine too closely. Months of recovery, possible complications, the end of Roberto's ability to perform the physical labor that had supported our family for 39 years. "What does that mean for work?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "It means I can't bid on the shopping center project," Roberto said flatly. "Can't commit to 18 months of work when I might be laid up for 6 months. Recovery time." The loss of the shopping center contract was disappointing, but it was also the least of our problems. If Roberto couldn't work construction anymore, we'd need to find entirely new sources of income. Our retirement savings wouldn't support us for another 7 years until Roberto became eligible for Social Security, and my complete absence from the workforce meant I had no recent experience to offer potential employers. Maybe it won't be that serious, I said, trying to maintain optimism despite the fear that was beginning to build in my chest. Maybe the specialist will have less invasive options. Roberto shrugged, but his expression suggested he wasn't hopeful. Dr. Martinez says I've been compensating for spinal problems for years. The injury last month just made visible what was already happening. We spent the rest of the afternoon researching Roberto's condition online, learning about surgical procedures, and recovery timelines and long-term prognosis for men his age with similar injuries. The information wasn't encouraging. Even successful surgery would limit Roberto's ability to lift heavy objects, work on ladders, or perform the kind of strenuous physical labor that construction required. I could try to keep working with restrictions, Roberto said, but we both knew that wasn't realistic. Construction was an all-or-nothing profession that didn't accommodate partial disabilities gracefully. What about the business? I asked. Could we hire someone to handle the physical work while you manage projects? With what money? Roberto replied practically. We'd need to pay competitive wages plus benefits, plus insurance, plus workers' compensation. The margins aren't big enough to support that kind of overhead, unless we were handling much larger projects. Larger projects that required the kind of professional presentation capabilities we'd been developing, the sophisticated business management skills I was learning through my research and preparation for college classes. Projects that demanded exactly the kind of partnership we'd been building between Roberto's practical experience and my analytical abilities. What if we approached this differently? I suggested slowly, an idea beginning to form. What if instead of thinking about how to maintain your current business model, we considered how to transform it into something that plays to our combined strengths? Roberto looked skeptical. What do you mean? You have 39 years of construction knowledge, I said, thinking aloud. You understand everything about how projects should be managed, what quality workmanship looks like, how to coordinate subcontractors and suppliers. That expertise doesn't disappear just because you can't swing a hammer anymore. But knowledge without the ability to implement it isn't worth much in construction, Roberto pointed out. Unless you're offering consulting services instead of direct labor, I replied. Project management for clients who want expert oversight but prefer to hire their own crews. Quality control inspections for homeowners who don't know how to evaluate. Contractor work. Cost estimation services for people planning renovations. The concept was taking shape as I spoke, possibilities emerging from the disaster we'd been dreading. Roberto's experience was valuable, independent of his physical capacity to perform construction work. Combined with the business management skills I was developing, we could create an entirely new kind of enterprise. I don't know anything about running a consulting business, Roberto said, but he sounded intrigued rather than dismissive. I'm learning, I replied. And we have time to figure it out while you recover from surgery. We spent the evening researching construction consulting services, discovering a market we'd never considered but that seemed perfectly suited to our evolving capabilities. Homeowners who wanted expert guidance without full-service contractor pricing. Small businesses that needed construction oversight but couldn't afford to hire project managers full-time. Real estate investors who required quality assessments before purchasing properties. This could actually work, Roberto said, after we'd reviewed several successful consulting firms online. There's definitely demand for these services. And we already have most of the knowledge we'd need, I added, plus all the supplier relationships and subcontractor connections you've built over the years. The transformation wouldn't be easy. We'd need business licenses, insurance, marketing materials, formal procedures for everything from client consultations to project reporting. But it was achievable, especially if we approached it systematically using the skills I was developing through my business management research. More importantly, it would allow us to work together as true partners, combining Roberto's practical expertise with my organizational and analytical abilities. We'd be building something new, rather than simply trying to maintain something that was no longer sustainable. Roberto's appointment with the orthopedic surgeon was scheduled for the following Friday. We spent the intervening days researching, consulting business models, and beginning to envision what our transformed enterprise might look like. The anxiety about Roberto's health remained, but it was balanced by excitement about possibilities we were discovering. The surgeon confirmed what we'd suspected. Roberto needed extensive spinal surgery that would require months of recovery and permanent restrictions on physical activity. But instead of devastating us, the news felt like confirmation that we were headed in the right direction. 6 months recovery time, Roberto reported after his consultation. Perfect for getting our consulting business established. And by the time you're cleared for limited activity, we'll have our first clients and proven systems, I added. We were transforming a crisis into an opportunity, using Roberto's forced retirement from physical labor as motivation to create something better suited to this stage of our lives. The process required courage and creativity and a willingness to risk failure. But it also offered possibilities we'd never considered while trapped in the patterns that had defined our relationship for decades. 3 weeks after Roberto's surgery, which had gone better than expected, I was sitting in our transformed home office when Sophia called with news that would test our new partnership in ways we hadn't anticipated. "Mom, I need to talk to you." "About something important," Sophia said, her voice carrying an emotion I couldn't identify. "Can you come over tonight after Isabella's in bed?" "Of course," I replied, concerned by the serious tone. "Is everything all right?" "Just come over around 8, okay? There's something I need to discuss with you." Sophia's apartment was only 15 minutes away, but the drive felt longer as I worried about what might be troubling my daughter. Her real estate business was thriving, Isabella was healthy and happy, and Sophia's social life seemed more active than it had been in years. What problem could require such a formal discussion? Sophia greeted me at the door looking unusually nervous, her normally confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. "How's Dad doing?" she asked as we settled in her living room with cups of coffee. "Better than expected," I replied. "He's following all the doctor's orders, and his incision is healing well. We've been working on business plans for our consulting service." "That's good," Sophia said absently, then took a deep breath. "Mom, I need to tell you something that I probably should have mentioned a long time ago." The tone sent alarm bells through my consciousness. In my experience, conversations that began with those words rarely ended well. "When I was getting my real estate license," Sophia continued, "I needed references from people who knew my character and work ethic. You remember signing some papers for me?" I did remember. Sophia had brought several documents that required my signature as a character reference, proof of family support, standard paperwork for professional licensing. I'd signed them without reading carefully, trusting that my daughter wouldn't ask me to approve anything problematic. "Those papers weren't just references," Sophia said quietly. "One of them was a loan application. I used your name and credit history to qualify for a business loan that I needed to get started." The words hit me like cold water. Sophia had used my financial information without my knowledge to secure funding for her business? My daughter, whom I'd trusted implicitly, had committed what amounted to identity theft using my signature and social security number? "How much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. $50,000, Sophia replied, unable to meet my eyes. "But Mom, I've been making all the payments." "Your credit hasn't been affected, and I only have about $20,000 left to pay off." $50,000. Sophia had borrowed $50,000 in my name without my knowledge or consent, using my creditworthiness to fund her business startup. The betrayal felt worse than the financial risk, though both were staggering. "Why?" I asked, struggling to understand how my daughter could have deceived me so completely. "Because I couldn't qualify on my own," Sophia said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I was a single mother with no business history and limited credit. But your credit score was perfect, and you had the income from Dad's business to support the loan. My perfect credit score, earned through 37 years of careful financial management. My good standing with lenders, built through decades of reliable mortgage and credit card payments. My economic stability, achieved through sacrifice and prudent decisions. All of it exploited by my own daughter for her personal benefit. You had no right, I said, anger beginning to replace shock. You had no right to use my financial information without telling me. I know, Sophia sobbed. I know it was wrong. But Mom, I was desperate. I'd been working for other agents for 3 years, watching them get rich while I earned tiny commissions on their deals. I knew I could succeed if I could just get my own license and start my own business. So you stole from me, I said flatly. I borrowed from you, Sophia protested. I always intended to tell you eventually, and I've never missed a payment. Your credit is actually better now than it was before because of my payment history. The rationalization made the betrayal worse, rather than better. Sophia had calculated how to use me for her benefit, convinced herself that the deception was justified by her success, and hidden the truth for years while I remained ignorant of my own financial obligations. What if you'd failed? I asked. What if your business hadn't succeeded and you couldn't make the payments? I would have been responsible for debt I never agreed to take on. But that didn't happen, Sophia said desperately. I did succeed. My business is thriving, and I'll have the loan paid off within 2 years. That's not the point, I replied, standing up and pacing across her living room. The point is that you lied to me. You used my financial identity without my permission. You put my credit and my future at risk for your benefit. Sophia collapsed into tears, the controlled facade she usually maintained crumbling under the weight of guilt she'd been carrying for years. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. But she had hurt me more deeply than any financial loss could have. My daughter, whom I'd raised to value honesty and integrity, had betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way possible. She'd seen me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person whose consent mattered. Why are you telling me now? I asked, when Sophia's crying subsided. Because you're becoming more involved in Dad's business, Sophia replied, wiping her eyes with tissues. You're learning about finances and credit and business loans. I was afraid you'd discover the debt when you started reviewing your credit reports. Self-preservation, not conscience, had motivated this confession. Sophia was protecting herself from discovery rather than trying to make amends for her deception. The realization made her betrayal feel even worse. I need to go home, I said, gathering my purse and heading toward the door. I need to think about this. Mom, please, Sophia called after me. Can't we work this out? I'll transfer the loan to my own name as soon as possible. I'll make it right. But some things couldn't be made right through after-the-fact corrections. Trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired simply by eliminating the practical consequences of betrayal. Sophia had shown me how she really viewed our relationship, as a hierarchy where her needs took precedence over my rights, where her success justified any deception necessary to achieve it. I drove home through streets that looked familiar but felt foreign, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. For 5 years, I'd been legally responsible for debt I didn't know existed, vulnerable to financial consequences from business decisions I'd never made. My credit score, my borrowing capacity, my economic security, all of it had been at risk without my knowledge. Worse than the financial betrayal was the personal one. Sophia had looked at me and seen someone whose consent didn't matter, whose autonomy could be ignored if it served her purposes. She'd reduced me to a means to an end, a resource to be utilized rather than a person to be respected. Roberto was asleep when I arrived home, recovering from surgery that had been more extensive than initially planned. I sat in our kitchen, surrounded by the business plans we'd been developing, wondering how this new crisis would affect everything we'd been building together. Because this was a crisis that would affect our future in ways Sophia probably hadn't considered. If I was legally responsible for her loan, that debt would appear on financial statements when Roberto and I applied for business credit for our consulting service. It would affect our borrowing capacity, our insurance rates, our ability to qualify for the professional licenses we needed. Sophia's deception hadn't just betrayed my trust, it had potentially sabotaged the new life Roberto and I were trying to create together. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and business documents when Roberto emerged from our bedroom, moving slowly but looking more alert than he had since the surgery. "You're up early?" he observed, settling carefully into his usual chair. "How did your visit with Sophia go?" I'd been dreading this conversation, unsure how to explain Sophia's betrayal without destroying Roberto's relationship with his daughter. But secrecy and deception had caused enough problems in our family. It was time for complete honesty about our financial situation. "Sophia has been making loan payments in my name for the past 5 years, I said without preamble. $50,000 she borrowed to start her real estate business. Roberto stared at me for a long moment, processing this unexpected information. "She borrowed money using your credit?" "Without telling me," I confirmed. "She had me sign papers that I thought were character references, but one of them was actually a loan application." Roberto's expression shifted from confusion to anger as he understood the implications. "She forged your signature on a loan application?" "She had my permission to sign the papers," I clarified. "I just didn't know what they were for." "That's the same as forgery," Roberto said flatly. "She deceived you into signing legal documents without explaining what they were." The conversation continued for an hour as I explained everything Sophia had told me, Roberto's anger growing as he understood the full scope of her deception. But his anger wasn't directed only at Sophia. He was also furious with himself for not being more involved in our family's financial affairs. "I should have been reviewing our credit reports," Roberto said. "Should have been monitoring what debts we had in our names." "We both should have been more careful," I agreed, "but that doesn't excuse what Sophia did." Roberto was quiet for several minutes, thinking through the implications of this new information. "This affects our business plans," he said finally. "I know," I replied. "We'll need to account for that debt when we apply for business credit. And we'll need to decide whether to let Sophia continue making payments or demand that she transfer the loan to her own name immediately," Roberto added. The practical questions were important, but they paled beside the emotional crisis Sophia's betrayal had created. How do you maintain a relationship with someone who's demonstrated such complete disregard for your autonomy and trust? How do you continue loving a daughter who's shown that she sees you as a resource rather than a person? These questions became more urgent 3 days later when Sophia appeared at our door unannounced, looking haggard and desperate in ways I'd never seen before. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to both of you," she said, pushing past me into our living room. "There's been a development with the loan situation." Roberto and I exchanged glances, neither of us prepared for whatever new crisis Sophia was bringing into our carefully ordered recovery environment. "The loan is being called in," Sophia announced, without preamble. The bank was bought by a larger institution, and they're requiring all business loans to be restructured or paid off within 90 days. Called in. Sophia's business loan, my business loan, was now due in full within 3 months. $20,000 that neither Roberto nor I had available, especially with Roberto unable to work and our consulting business still in the planning stages. "What does that mean for us?" Roberto asked, though I suspected we both knew the answer. "It means I need to qualify for a new loan to pay off the old one," Sophia said, her voice shaking with stress. "But my current debt-to-income ratio is too high because of some investment properties I bought last year." "Investment properties," Sophia had been expanding her business using credit I didn't know existed, leveraging my good standing with lenders to build a real estate portfolio that was now threatening our shared financial stability. "I need you to co-sign a new loan," Sophia continued, looking directly at me. "$20,000 to pay off the current balance, and I'll make sure all future payments come directly from my business accounts. Co-sign another loan." Sophia was asking me to voluntarily take on additional debt after spending 5 years secretly obligating me to debt I'd never agreed to assume. The audacity was breathtaking. "Absolutely not," I said without hesitation. "Mom, please," Sophia begged. "If we can't pay off this loan, it will destroy your credit rating. You'll be in default on a debt you didn't even know you had." The threat was clear: help Sophia maintain her business expansion or suffer the financial consequences of her previous deception. She was holding my credit rating hostage to force my cooperation with her continued borrowing. "This is extortion," Roberto said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger I'd rarely heard from him. "You're threatening to destroy your mother's credit unless she helps you expand your business even further." "I'm trying to protect her," Sophia protested. "If I can't get a new loan, we're all going to suffer when the current loan goes into default." But I was beginning to understand that Sophia's protection was really manipulation. Her concern for my welfare was really concern for her own business interests. She needed my creditworthiness to maintain the lifestyle and success she'd built using my financial identity. "There's another option," I said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "We could force you to transfer all your properties to our names as collateral for the debt you've created in our names." Sophia's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you've been using our credit to build your real estate portfolio, then we have legal claim to the assets purchased with borrowed money we're responsible for," I explained, the analytical skills I'd been developing suddenly useful in ways I'd never anticipated. "You can't do that," Sophia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, we can," Roberto said, understanding immediately where my logic was leading. "If you've borrowed money in our names to purchase investment properties, those properties can be claimed as collateral for the debts we're responsible for." Sophia stared at us both, realizing that her years of deception had created vulnerabilities she'd never considered. By using our credit to fund her business expansion, she'd created legal connections between our financial interests and her property holdings. "I'll fight you in court," Sophia threatened, but we all knew she couldn't afford the legal fees while managing business debt and investment property mortgages. "Or," I said calmly, "you could transfer the investment properties to us immediately, and we'll assume responsibility for paying off the loan you took out in our names." It was a hard bargain, but a fair one. Sophia would lose her investment properties, but she'd be free from the debt she'd created in our names. We'd gain rental income from the properties to offset the loan payments we'd be making, and we'd have assets to secure our own business development. "Think about it," Roberto added. "You have 24 hours to decide whether you want to negotiate with us or with bankruptcy lawyers." Sophia left our house looking stunned, finally understanding that her parents weren't the passive victims she'd assumed we'd always be. The woman who'd meekly signed papers without reading them was gone, replaced by someone who understood legal rights and financial leverage. That evening, Roberto and I researched Sophia's investment properties online, discovering that she'd purchased 3 rental units over the past 2 years, using a combination of business credit and personal loans. The properties were generating positive cash flow, but they'd also created the debt obligations that were now threatening her ability to qualify for new business credit. "If we take over these properties, we'd have passive income to support our consulting business during the startup phase," Roberto observed. "And we'd be protected from Sophia's future financial decisions," I added. "No more surprises about debts we don't know we have." It wasn't the outcome any of us had wanted, but it was the logical consequence of Sophia's choices. She'd created a situation where our financial interests were intertwined with her business success, then made decisions that threatened everyone's stability. Taking control of the assets purchased with our credit was simply claiming what was already legally ours. Sophia called the next morning, her voice subdued but resigned. "I'll transfer the properties," she said without preamble. "But I want to maintain management responsibilities. I know the tenants. I understand the local market." "That's negotiable," I replied. "But the ownership transfers to us immediately, and all rental income goes toward paying off the loan you created in our names." "Agreed," Sophia said quietly. The legal paperwork took 3 weeks to complete, during which time Roberto and I consulted with lawyers to ensure our rights were protected and Sophia's obligations were clearly defined. The process was expensive and emotionally exhausting, but it established boundaries that should have existed from the beginning of Sophia's business development. When the transfers were complete, Roberto and I found ourselves owners of 3 rental properties, generating enough monthly income to support our household expenses while we developed our consulting business. It wasn't the retirement we'd planned, but it provided financial security and the foundation for building something new together. More importantly, the crisis had forced both of us to claim authority over our own financial future in ways we'd never done before. I was no longer the woman who signed papers without reading them, and Roberto was no longer the man who managed finances without consulting his partner. "We make a good team," Roberto said one evening as we reviewed rental property reports and consulting business plans spread across our dining room table. "We always did," I replied. "We just forgot for a while." The woman who'd felt invisible and irrelevant on Mother's Day 2 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who owned property, managed business interests, and made decisions that affected her own future. The transformation hadn't been easy or pleasant, but it had been necessary. Sometimes growth requires breaking things that no longer serve you. Sometimes love means setting boundaries rather than providing unlimited support. Sometimes family means protecting yourself from people who would exploit your goodness for their own benefit. I was learning all of these lessons at 62, discovering strengths I'd never known I possessed, reclaiming agency over a life I'd been living passively for far too long. The future was uncertain, but it was finally mine to shape. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.